Hello and welcome to this video on angles, positions and direction. This is part of the Level 1 and Level 2 Functional Skills Maths course. There are two learning outcomes for this video. The first is to use appropriate positional vocabulary to describe position and direction, including the 8 compass points and including full, half and quarter turns. The second learning outcome is to use angles when describing position and direction and measure angles in degrees. The linked learning for this video relates to what we've already done on angles on shapes. When we did angles on shapes, we talked about acute, obtuse, reflex and right angles, and we also learned how to measure those angles. We shall be using those skills in this lesson. We will also be covering the terminology clockwise, which means going around the clock the same way as the hands do, and anti-clockwise, which is going in the opposite direction. The first thing we're going to look at are our compass points. These are the positions around a compass, and we will start with the cardinal points, in other words, the main points around the compass. There were various ways to remember this at school. The way I remember it was never eat shredded wheat. So N, north, was at the top, east, then south, and then west. So our cardinal points are north, east, south, and west. Then we have what we call the intercardinal points, and these are the points in between the two. So between north and east is the position northeast. Between south and east is southeast. Between north and west is northwest. And between south and west is southwest. And they are the intercardinal points, made up of the 2 points they're trapped between. Here's an example of how you can use the cardinal and intercardinal points to state the direction of something. So here's my dog, Archie, and north is up in this direction above him. If Archie wants to go home, he heads in this direction, which we could say is northeast. If he wants to fetch his ball down in this direction, then we'd say he was heading southeast. And to go and collect his bone, we would say Archie was heading west. Another way to move around the compass or around bearings is using the expression of a turn. Now, a full turn is 360 degrees. And what we can do is we can divide it into 4 parts. We can say a quarter turn, we can say a half turn, or you could say a 3/4 turn. So a quarter turn is 90 degrees. A half turn is 180 degrees. A 3/4 turn is 270 degrees. And a full turn is 360 degrees. So here's a little practice for you using the terminology turn. So if I start with my arrow facing up the page and I do a quarter turn clockwise, then clockwise is in that direction. A quarter of a turn is 90 degrees. So my arrow would face off to the 3 o'clock position. For the next one down, a quarter turn anti-clockwise, so we're going in the opposite direction of a clock, we would end up with an arrow facing in that direction. Now, the starting point doesn't always have to be north. Sometimes you'll have other positions. So for the third one, if my starting point is east and I do a quarter turn anti-clockwise, so anti-clockwise is the opposite direction a clock would go, a quarter turn takes us to this position. The next one, if my starting position is west and I do a quarter turn clockwise, again, I end up facing north. And then finally, if my starting point is the 9 o'clock position, then 3/4 turn anti-clockwise. So anti-clockwise is that way. 3/4 of the way round would also take me to this position. Did you get these correct? And that completes our first learning outcome, to use the appropriate positional vocabulary to describe the position and direction, including the 8 compass points and including full, half and quarter turns. Now we need to move on to our second learning outcome, which is using angles when describing position and direction, and measure the angles in degrees. When you're talking about angles with respect to bearings, there are 3 rules that you must remember. The first is, whatever you're giving the direction for, it has to be relative to north. So you have to put things relative to north. The second thing is, whichever bearing you have, it has to go round clockwise from north. So your angle is going to be this angle here, not this little angle here. And then finally, when you give your bearing must be made up of 3 digits. So this angle here is approximately 300 degrees, and that would be a bearing of 300 degrees. However, if you had a position that the aircraft was heading over here, and the angle that you measured was 45 degrees, then to make it a bearing, you always need 3 digits. So it would be 045 degrees. So the rules of bearing are: 1, it must always start from north. 2, it must be measured in the clockwise direction. And 3, it must have 3 digits. So let's have a look at these questions and show you how to do this. First question is, what bearing is the hiker walking on? So if his start position was here, we have to draw our reference relative to north. That's rule number 1. Rule number 2 is we have to go clockwise from north to measure our angle. And then finally, whatever our angle is, it has to have 3 digits. So you would use your compass, as we've shown you in previous lessons on how to measure angles, and you would say this is 120 degrees. So it has the 3 digits that we need. Let's have a look at the next question. So what bearing is this ship on? So if its start position is here, rule number 1 says we have to measure north. Rule number 2 says we're looking for this bearing here. And then rule number 3 is we have to use 3 digits. So using your protractor, you might want to measure this angle here as 60 degrees. Then, because we know there are 360 degrees in a circle, we take away the 60 degrees, and it tells us that this outside angle is 300 degrees. So the bearing of the ship is 300 degrees. So here are 3 angles relative to north. However, they are not bearings. So remember the 3 rules and see if you can write down the 3 bearings that relate to these 3 angles. Okay, let's go through the answer. So here we've got it relative to north. That's rule number 1. Rule number 2 says we have to measure it clockwise. And then rule number 3, because they've got 35 degrees, says we have to use 3 digits. So the correct bearing for our first question is 035 degrees. Question number 2. Rule number 1 says relative to north. Rule number 2 says we go clockwise. And when we measure that angle, we know it's 90 degrees. But rule number 3 says we need 3 digits. So it's a bearing of 090 degrees for number 2. And then finally, for our angle on number 3, we have to have the bearing relative to north. That's rule number 1. So rule number 2 says we have to go clockwise around. So that's the bearing we're interested in. But we've been given this angle here, which is 45 degrees. So to find this outside angle, 360, take away the 45, leaves us with a bearing of 315 degrees. One of the most important things you have to remember about giving or receiving bearings is the terminology of and from. So of is where you want to end up, and from is where you started from. So what is the bearing of A from B? So from B is where we started. So if we draw a line between them, then the bearing from B is relative to north and measured this way around. So it's approximately 280 degrees. So it's the bearing of A from B. So from is the one we're interested in. So draw your reference to north and measure the angle around to the bearing to A. Let's try this with another couple of bearings. So what is the bearing of B? So that's our end position from A. So the from tells us the one we're interested in. So we draw it reference to north. If we draw a straight line between them, the angle we're interested in clockwise around is this angle here. And when we measure it, it is 120 degrees. So our bearing would be 120 degrees. You can combine the bearing with measurements as well to find positions of points. So for example, Tracy places a cross 8 centimeters on a bearing of 040 from her current position. So if Tracy is here and she's going to place a cross 8 centimeters from that point on a bearing of 040. So from north, we measure around 40 degrees and we draw a line in that direction until we get to 8 centimeters and we stop. So the position of the cross should be here, because this is a bearing of 040 and this distance is 8 centimeters. So we're combining the bearing with a distance. Finally, you can find cross bearings by drawing the bearings from 2 points, and where they cross you can find the third point. So here's an example for us. In order to find point C, we need to draw a bearing of 035 degrees from point A, and it needs to be 295 degrees from point B. So from A, in other words using A as a reference, we need to measure clockwise around 035 degrees and draw a straight line. So that's 035 degrees and we draw a straight line off to infinity. Then for 295 degrees from B, so from B you need to draw your north reference. You need to go clockwise round to 295 degrees and then draw from B a straight line to infinity on a bearing of 295 degrees. And where the 2 points cross, quite literally cross, then that's point C. And that completes our learning outcomes. So we've looked at using the appropriate positional vocabulary to describe position and direction, including the 8 compass points and including full, half and quarter turns. We've also used angles when describing position and direction, and we've measured angles in degrees. The buzzwords from this little section are cardinal points, that's north, south, east and west. The intercardinal points, which are northeast, southeast, southwest and northwest. A turn, which is a 360-degree rotation, but we also have a quarter turn, which is 90 degrees, and a half turn, which is 180 degrees. We know how to give and receive bearings by using the position relative to north, so our three rules. 1, it has to be relative to north. 2, you have to go round clockwise. And 3, you need 3 digits for a bearing. And then finally, the expressions of or from. Of is the one I'm interested in. From is the one that I measure from. And this concludes this video. If you've got any questions or want more practice at anything we've covered, then please see your tutor. I hope you've enjoyed this video.